Barbarians, chapters 27 and 28, the breaking point. We held the coastline, they held the highland, and they were sharp as knives. They heard the hum of the motors, they counted the rotors, and waited for us to arrive. Billy Joel. Good night, Saigon. Admiral. Fujimoto's eyes glittered in satisfaction as the two task forces finally merged, with the HKs in the center and the comets covering the flanks. The two fleets eyed each other warily, circling in opposition around the planet as they sized each other up. Part of her desperately wished to simply make a hard run-in, using the HKs to smash her way through and settle this once and for all, but she stayed her hand. Every engagement against the Konheim fleet had ended badly for the Triumvirate, and she didn't dare squander the chance she now had. So, if she wasn't content to merely hang there in the system, and a full-out assault wasn't in the cards just yet, what did that leave? A probing attack, perhaps? Tempting, but given the disposition of the enemy, any advance forces sent in would likely be hammered to pieces. That left a passing engagement, assuming the Konheim didn't strike first. If she ordered her fleet to sweep past the enemy, engaging each other like two ancient galleons firing broadsides, it still gave her the ability to break off if necessary. She could evaluate the new ships in action, and more importantly, give the Konheim a taste of what was to come. Diaksh! The enemy fleet has changed course, his tactical officer announced suddenly. Giage stared intently at the plot, nodding slowly as the Triumvirate fleet began their run. It seemed they wished to test their mettle before committing to a full engagement. That suited him completely, for these new ships were an unknown quality, and until he had a better sense of what they could do, he too was leery of pressing an attack home. "Bring the fleet about," he ordered. "We will indulge the enemy. If they wish to touch blades, it would be dishonorable to refuse the challenge," he said, with a thin smile. Helene had wondered how the Konheim would respond to her challenge, and it seemed they were just as curious about her as she was about them. They could have broken off or moved to intercept, but instead they were mirroring her movements as they closed the distance. They were like two ancient knights on horseback, their lances leveled as they charged one another in a jousting tournament. It was almost as formal as a duel, but 1,000 times bloodier. The HKs swung their turrets starboard, tracking the Konheim fleet as they closed the distance, while the comets stood ready to intercept the inbound missiles. It was exactly this type of engagement that was all but impossible to forecast, for each ship class had its pluses and minuses. The Konheim ships were massive, far more able to soak up damage while spewing out wave after wave of missiles in return. But they were also filled with thousands of living, breathing beings. A punctured hull meant death to anyone nearby if they were not suited up, but even that was no guarantee. It was as if their enormous size brought with it a vulnerability of its own. The HKs, on the other hand, held exactly one crewman, and since the Ronin did not require atmosphere to breathe, a hull breach did not mean an automatic fatality. But they were also much smaller craft, and if the enemy maged a good solid hit that penetrated their armor, there was a strong chance the ship would be completely destroyed. Even as they neared weapons range, both fleets still had the ability to break off the engagement if they so chose, but neither side showed any intention of doing so. Unless something drastically unexpected took place, they were committed to following through. Minute by agonizing minute they closed the distance, entering extreme weapons range, but Admiral Fujimoto held back. She wanted to make each shot count, and the closer they got, the better the odds. Unfortunately, the same was also true for the enemy. They passed through long range with neither fleet firing, each side boring in steadily as they both held their fire, conserving their ammunition. Entering medium range, Helene was tempted to give the order, but still she held back, waiting to see if the Konheim would be the first to blink. It was a game of chicken now, as they raced towards one another, but as their vectors began to converge, she could wait no longer. "Fire!" she ordered, as both fleets unleashed hell. Giage had to admire the humans' intrepidness. It was tempting for any commander to open fire the instant they had the range, but doing so would merely deplete one's magazine chasing low-probability hits. As they screamed towards one another, it became a source of fascination for him, wondering just how close the humans planned on getting before bringing their weapons into action. Would they wait until they reached point-blank range? He found it unlikely, for he certainly had no intentions of waiting that long, robbing himself of opportunities to inflict real harm on the enemy fleet. There was a perfect moment to fire. He did not know what it was just yet, but he would know when the time was right. Of that he was certain, and then it did come. His first missiles were just clearing the fleet, when the enemy returned fire. Or perhaps they fired first. It was hard to say. Hundreds of guided projectiles arced away, seeking out the enemy ships, bobbing and jinking to avoid destruction as they bored in. Giage watched with satisfaction as the triumvirate craft began to die, but for every missile that struck home, half a dozen others found nothing but space. It was a game of numbers. How many of them could one kill before they did the same to you? But then, it was their turn, and with quiet despair, Giage watched the enemy's deadly antimatter rounds blast through his ships, tearing into their hulls and exposing whole sections to space. His own flagship Oathkeeper shuddered as half a dozen rounds ripped into her flesh, seeking the soft meat within. Whole sections of his display turned bright orange, signifying damaged systems and blasted compartments. Alarms blared loudly on all decks as his engineers raced to repair the damage, while others carried their wounded cohorts away from the shattered sections to safety. Requite and Vindication disappeared in balls of flame, and a dozen more staggered out of formation with heavy damage, including Oathkeeper. Admiral Fujimoto gripped her armrests tightly as the comets and HKs began to disappear. The weapons were flying too fast and furious for anything other than a computer to keep track, but keep it track it did, updating her constantly as the two fleets tore at each other. The HKs were performing even better than she'd hoped. As small as they were in comparison to the Konheim ships, they were hard to lock onto. And as heavily armored as they were equally difficult to kill. Despite all that, they weren't invulnerable. The HKs might die hard, but they still died. But even as her own ships perished, the enemy was getting hammered hard. It was far too early in the engagement to declare a victory, but as they continued to sweep past the Konheim fleet, Helene began to feel a sense of cautious optimism. They were holding their own, which, considering their previous battles, was cause for celebration. And as the two fleets broke apart and peeled off in opposite directions, she was finally able to let go of the breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. Death and destruction lie in their wake, but the bulk of her fleet was still intact, still able to fight. And as she ordered the flotilla to regroup and assess their losses, she was already planning their next engagement. This first battle had been a test, as both her and her counterpart gauged each other's strengths and weaknesses. Their next encounter, however, would be a bloodbath. Klaxon screamed on Oathkeeper's bridge as the ship shuddered yet again. One of the enemy's rounds had burrowed its way into engineering, tearing into the power plant that was the ship's heart. Giage gripped his console tightly as she began to buck and shake as his harried and frantic engineer gave his report. "It is no use, Diaksh," he informed him. "We have suffered too much damage to save the ship. We must abandon before we lose her crew as well." It was the last thing in the universe Giage wished to hear. Oathkeeper was not just any ship, nor even from where he led the crusade, but something far more important and powerful. Her very name carried their promise to their forebears, and losing her felt as if they were betraying the cause itself. But flesh and metal had their limits, and it appeared that no matter how mighty Oathkeeper once had been, she was no more. "Very well," he said reluctantly. "I will shift my command to Wrath while we—" A massive explosion knocked them off their feet as Oathkeeper broke her back. Her hull buckled and screamed in agony as her death throes threatened to take the rest of her crew with her to the grave, as Giage clawed his way back to his console. "Abandon ship!" he gasped, as the sound of tearing metal filled their ears. "All hands, make for the life pods!" Reports were still coming in from the fleet, and Admiral Fujimoto grimaced as she read the butcher's bill. It wasn't as bad as she'd feared, but it had been bad enough. though by the looks of the enemy they had taken the bigger blow. Even as she watched, yet another Konhim vessel bled out, shedding escape pods as it began to disintegrate. And then something odd happened. The rest of the enemy ships began to move, altering their formation, forming what appeared to be a protective shell around the dying craft. Helene's eyes narrowed as she watched them take their positions. But what was the point? That ship was dead. It was as obvious to her as it had to be to them, so why on earth would they— A sharp gasp of air betrayed her realization. There was only one reason she could think of, and if she was right, Helene thought furiously. If they somehow had managed to take out the Konhim flagship, then they had a golden opportunity before them. Command would be confused, disjointed, but it would not last long. If she was going to do this, then she dare not hesitate even for an instant. But was the risk worth taking? Her jaw hardened as she made her decision. Admiral Fujimoto stabbed the comm button on her console and snarled into the mic. "All ships, come about! Back at them, boys, straight into their teeth. You'll take my life, but I'll take yours too. You'll fire your musket, but I'll run you through. So when you're waiting for the next attack, you'd better stand. There's no turning back." The bugle sounds as the charge begins, but on this battlefield no one wins. The smell of acrid smoke and horse's breath, as you plunge into a certain death. Iron Maiden, the trooper. Admiral Fujimoto watched the Konhim like a hawk as she brought the fleet back around for a second pass. The enemy flagship was still shedding escape pods and spewing plasma as her ships raced to catch back up, and for the moment, they didn't seem to be reacting to her course change, but there was no way that would last. Despite the damage, it would only be a matter of minutes before they reorganized their formation, but then what? Would they yield the system or stand and fight? She'd hurt them, but Helene was convinced they wouldn't give up quite so easily. In fact, having the Konhim flee before her was the last thing she wanted, because if they managed to escape, there was no telling where they'd go. Even though the enemy fleet was still struggling to deal with the loss of their flagship, their speed hadn't dropped off all that much, which forced them to try and play catch-up. There was an old naval saying, "A stern chase is a long chase," and despite all the advantages she held this time around, it was going to take time for them to get within weapons range once more. Diaksh Jiaj Guyaz stumbled through the corridor of his dying flagship with the rest of his crew as they made for the life pods. Like any commander, he'd hoped they'd never be necessary, but like any good commander, he had also prepared for the worst. Another shuddering blast rocked Oathkeeper as he arrived at the emergency station, slapping the large orange button to open the hatch and revealing the 5-man pod on the ship's hull. He and his tactical officer, as well as 3 of the bridge crew, piled in and sealed the hatch, hastily strapping in as the life pod began its brief countdown sequence. With any luck, they'd be quickly picked up by one of the other ships, but even as the pod blasted away from the ship, Jiaj hungered to know what was happening with the enemy fleet. He had to get to another ship and take control of the battle once more, for this time the humans had planned their attack with care. And unless he could see with his own eyes what they were doing, there was an all-too-real chance they might carry the day. His tactical officer was already plugged into the pod's communicator, trying to hail one of the other ships in the fleet. But with all the other life pods clamoring for attention, their message was simply lost in the noise. The engines fired suddenly, catching him off guard, and as he stared out the porthole in alarm, Jiaj realized the pod's emergency systems had decided that instead of waiting in space for retrieval, it was far safer to deliver its occupants onto the planet's surface below. It made perfect sense from an emergency standpoint. On Zaronk, there was atmosphere, food, and water, all the resources necessary for long-term survival. From a tactical standpoint, however, it was a disaster. "Override the engines!" he shouted to his tactical officer, as he grabbed the rudimentary controls and struggled to fly the pod back towards the fleet. His officer was frantically trying to nullify the pod's predetermined flight path, but the simple machine was having none of it. It had been designed with one purpose in mind, to keep its passengers alive, and its builders had understood there was a very real possibility that its occupants might try and do something stupid out of panic. Something stupid like trying to blast away from the safety of a planet surface and towards a battle zone in space. "I can't!" his officer screeched in reply as the pod's engines drove them towards Zaronk. The triumvirate fleet streaked towards the enemy as Admiral Fujimoto watched in chagrin as the Konhim finally reacted to her attack run. There had never been any real chance she would have been able to fly all the way in without being noticed, despite the loss of the flagship. But she'd hoped and prayed nonetheless. Unfortunately, the gods of war didn't seem to be listening. Their response was ragged and poorly coordinated, just as she'd counted on. But would it be enough? There was still time to abort her attack if she had to. Only it was highly unlikely she'd get another opportunity like this. If she'd learned anything about combat, the real thing, not the simulations she'd spent her life mastering, it was that victory did not go to the best. No, victory went to the one who screwed up the least. There would be no finesse this time, no clever last-minute maneuver, no surprise reinforcements coming to save their bacon. What she had was all she had, and the math was as brutal as it was simple. The Konhim were turning to meet her, making the same decision she had, and as the two fleets raced headlong into each other's embrace, she knew this time it was going to be a goddamned massacre. Helene did her best to give the impression of serenity to her crew, but they could read the displays just as well as she could. Their expressions hovered somewhere between grim determination and morbid fascination, each of them wondering if they would still be alive when the two fleets met. For many of them, the answer would be no. Nassat looked at the faces of those under his command and did his best to appear confident. Sergeant Lin always had, and as a frightened recruit, he had drawn strength from that. Had he felt as I do? He wondered. If so, the human was far better at concealing it, in his opinion, though as he gazed into the eyes of his soldiers, what he saw reflected in them humbled him beyond words. They trusted him to get them through the coming battles safely, trusted him to not waver or falter when they faced the enemy, trusted him to stand at their side, no matter what. Dear Creator, let me be worthy of that trust, he prayed silently as he rose to his feet. When we reach Zaronk, remember your training, he informed them. Put as much distance as you can from the shuttles when we land, and remember to disperse. Clumping together may feel safe to you, the familiarity of the herd, but I can assure you that it is not. The enemy will see that as a target of opportunity, so remember the human creed of combat. One of the new recruits raised his hand. Sergeant, what creed is that? Somehow a wry smile appeared on his face. Try to look unimportant. They may be low on ammo. A nervous titter of laughter filled the shuttle's hold as their ship headed for battle. Helene watched the two fleets racing to annihilate each other, with the inevitability of an onrushing avalanche. It was up to them now, the individual pilots, and as they closed to weapons range, she keyed her mic. This is Admiral Fujimoto to all ships. The Konhim flagship is out of action thanks to you, so this is our chance. A fierce grin was plastered on her face as the clock slowly counted down. Today we make the enemy pay for all they've done, and every single one of the victims lost to the invaders rides with us. Their blood cries out for vengeance, and it will not be denied. We will not be denied! Her visage grew dark and unflinching as she gazed at them all, as ancient words came to her in her hour of need. I hope you all had a hearty meal, for tonight we dine in hell. All ships, fire! The triumvirate fleet exploded with weapons fire as antimatter rounds snarled towards the enemy. Moments later, an answering storm cloud of missiles arced away from the Konhim fleet, blotting out Zaronk's sun as both formations dissolved in chaos. Long ago, combat pilots had dubbed the anarchy of mass aerial combat as the furball, a swirling, writhing orb of death and destruction. The triumvirate pilots knew what was at stake, and for races who had spent millennia espousing pacifism, they had somehow managed to discover their primal selves in the heat of battle. Missiles and antimatter chased craft with reckless abandon, the explosions marking the deaths of friend and enemy alike. There was no time for strategy. Just find a target, aim and fire, check your six, race for safety, re-engage a target of opportunity, dodge an incoming missile, fire at your enemy, find another target, and try to stay alive. While all the while, your enemy was doing the exact same thing to you. Not even the computers could keep up with the insanity as the two fleets ripped each other apart, clawing and tearing and rending each other to bits. Ships slammed into each other and detonated with frightfully common frequency, and it was just as likely to be Allied craft dying in accidental fratricide as it was enemy vessels dragging each other into extinction. Crippled ships pinwheeled out of sight, only to explode as some hapless pilot discovered the debris by accident. They killed and fought and died by the hundreds, with no end in sight. Gyaksh Guyaz tore open the life pod's hatch and stumbled out on the surface, his eyes immediately searching the sky above him. The soundless flashes of light showed him exactly what he'd feared. His carefully crafted battle plan was falling apart, and unless he could take back control, the fleet teetered on the brink of extinction. "I must get back up there!" he howled in frustration as he turned to his tactical officer. "There has to be one of our shuttles somewhere near here. Something we can commandeer?" Thankfully, the sensors aboard the life pod were functioning perfectly, even if he had strongly disagreed with its programming. "There appear to be a few assault craft bearing 218, his officer informed him after a moment. "I will attempt to radio them now and request extraction." "Quickly!" Giage urged, "before there is nothing left." The voice on the loudspeaker was Ophipteran, as most pilots were. Nasat and his company lifted their heads as the announcement filled the compartment. "All hands ETA to the Zaronk system is 10 minutes. Shuttle pilots, stand by. LZ is hot. Repeat, LZ is hot." Nasat drew a deep breath. "May the Creator be with you all," he told his company as the shuttle's engines began to whine.